Vienna is a small city, less than 2 million people, landlocked, in the center of Europe, and yet for 2 centuries, it produced more ideas that changed the world than almost any other place on Earth. Some historians suggest that is not a coincidence. Walk through Vienna on an autumn morning. The streets are wide and orderly. The buildings are monumental, designed to make you feel the weight of history. A coffee house on every corner, not cafes. Coffee houses, places where you could sit for 4 hours with 1 cup and a newspaper and argue about philosophy, music, politics, and the nature of the human mind. Vienna's coffee house culture is listed as a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. But it is more than that. It was an institution, a space where the mixing of ideas across disciplines, between musicians and physicians, philosophers and architects, writers and scientists, produced a concentration of intellectual output that has never quite been replicated. Some historians call the period between 1880 and 1930 Vienna's Golden Age, a half-century in which a single city produced Freud, Wittgenstein, Mahler, Klimt, Schiele, Schoenberg, Hayek, Popper, and Herzl, among others. What happened here? 5 forces, each one shaping not just Vienna, but the world that came after it. What the textbooks say. Vienna became a major European capital through the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs ruled Austria, and at various times, much of Europe from the 13th century until 1918. At its peak, the Habsburg Empire covered 50 million people across a dozen nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Croatians, Slovaks, Romanians, Jews, all governed from Vienna. In 1814–15, the Congress of Vienna, the peace conference that reorganized Europe after Napoleon established Vienna as the diplomatic center of the continent. For a century after, the European balance of power was managed largely through Viennese diplomacy. The empire collapsed in 1918, a consequence of the First World War. The Habsburg dynasty ended. The empire fragmented into a dozen successor states, and Vienna, a capital city that had governed 50 million people, suddenly governed fewer than 7. The official story presents Vienna as a great imperial city that rose and fell with the Habsburg dynasty. What the textbooks rarely ask is why this particular city, in its final decades before the collapse, produced such an extraordinary concentration of ideas that are still shaping the world. Force 1. The music. Vienna's relationship with music is so deep that it is difficult to see clearly. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler, Strauss, Schoenberg. Every major figure in the Western classical tradition either was born in Vienna, died in Vienna, or spent their defining years there. This is not coincidence. Vienna had the institutions, the court opera, the concert halls, the music academies, the publishers, but more than institutions, it had an audience. A Viennese audience that took music with a seriousness that no other city matched. Some music historians suggest that Vienna's musical culture was not simply a product of patronage. It was a form of civic identity. In a city governing a dozen nationalities who shared no common language, music was the one thing they could all participate in equally. One interpretation holds that the extraordinary concentration of musical genius in Vienna was partly a consequence of this demand. When a city takes music seriously enough to make it a form of civic religion, The best musicians in the world come to be judged by it. The record shows a city that produced or attracted more canonical composers than the rest of Europe combined across a 100-year period. What it doesn't show is what created the demand. Perhaps the empire's diversity, perhaps the coffee houses, perhaps something in the particular air of a city built at the crossroads of everything. Force 2. The mind. In 1899, Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams. It sold poorly at first, but the ideas it contained, that the human mind has an unconscious layer, that dreams carry meaning, that childhood experience shapes adult behavior, eventually transformed how the entire Western world understood itself. Freud was Viennese. So were many of his earliest colleagues and critics. Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, Viktor Frankl, Melanie Klein. The psychoanalytic movement was a Viennese invention. Some intellectual historians suggest this was not accidental. Vienna in 1900 was a city of repression and explosion simultaneously. A deeply conservative imperial society with rigid class structures, formal social codes, and an elaborate system of what could and could not be said publicly. Sitting on top of an extraordinarily creative, restless, and questioning intellectual class, one interpretation holds that psychoanalysis emerged in Vienna because Vienna needed it. A society that cannot speak certain things openly develops a particular interest in what lies beneath the surface. The record shows a city that produced, within a few decades, most of the foundational concepts of modern psychology. What it doesn't show is why those concepts had to wait for Vienna to articulate them. Perhaps every city has its unconscious. Vienna was simply the first to look directly at its own. Force 3. The Congress. In September 1814, the representatives of every major European power gathered in Vienna. Napoleon had been defeated. The map of Europe needed to be redrawn. The Congress of Vienna lasted until June 1815, 9 months of negotiation, diplomacy, and what one observer called organized dancing. The outcome was the Concert of Europe, a system of great power cooperation that maintained relative peace on the continent for nearly a century. From 1815 to 1914, 100 years, Europe avoided a general war. Some diplomatic historians consider this the most successful peace settlement in modern history. One interpretation holds that the Congress of Vienna established something more than a territorial settlement. It established a method, the idea that major powers could sit together, acknowledge each other's interests, and negotiate outcomes that none of them fully wanted but all could accept, became the model for every major international settlement that followed. The League of Nations, the United Nations, the European Union, all of them, some historians suggest, are descendants of the method developed in Vienna in 1814. The record shows a peace settlement that lasted a century. What it doesn't show is what made Vienna the right place for it. A city that had spent 5 centuries governing irreconcilable differences. Perhaps knew something about compromise that other capitals did not. Force 4. The philosophy. In the 1920s, a group of philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists began meeting in Vienna. They called themselves the Vienna Circle. Their project, to establish what could be meaningfully said and what could not, to apply the rigor of mathematics and science to philosophy itself, to eliminate, once and for all, the metaphysical claims that had cluttered Western thinking for centuries. The Vienna Circle produced logical positivism, the philosophical position that only statements verifiable by evidence or logic are meaningful. It sounds abstract, Its consequences were not. Logical positivism and the philosophical tradition it generated shaped the development of computer science, linguistics, cognitive science, and the philosophy of science throughout the 20th century. Ludwig Wittgenstein, loosely associated with the Circle, produced two of the most influential philosophical works of the century in his Viennese years. Some philosophers suggest that the Vienna Circle represents the most concentrated single-city contribution to Western philosophy since ancient Athens. One interpretation holds that this was possible in Vienna, precisely because Vienna was ending. A city that sensed its world collapsing had a particular urgency about establishing what was actually true, what could be known, what could be said, what remained after everything else was stripped away. The record shows a philosophical movement that emerged from a city in decline and outlasted it by a century. What it doesn't show is whether the decline was a precondition. Perhaps clarity requires the pressure of endings. Force 5. The diaspora. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Within weeks, the intellectual life of Vienna was destroyed. Freud fled to London. Wittgenstein was already in Cambridge. Popper went to New Zealand. Hayek went to London. Schoenberg went to Los Angeles. The Vienna Circle scattered across the English-speaking world. Dozens of Viennese intellectuals, Jewish and non-Jewish, carried the ideas of their city to universities in Britain, America, and Australia. Some intellectual historians suggest that the post-war transformation of Anglo-American intellectual life, the rise of psychoanalysis in American culture, the dominance of logical empiricism in American philosophy, the influence of Austrian economics, was largely a consequence of the Viennese diaspora. One interpretation holds that Vienna's greatest export was not its music, or its coffee houses, or its imperial diplomacy. It was its people. The ideas that Vienna generated in its golden age were spread across the world, not by books, but by the people who were forced to leave. The record shows a city that lost most of its intellectual class in a single decade. What it doesn't show is how much of the 20th century was shaped by what those people carried with them. Perhaps the most powerful cities are not the ones that keep their ideas. They are the ones whose ideas cannot be contained. Conclusion: Vienna was never the largest city in Europe, never the most powerful, never the most strategically located. And yet, for 2 centuries, it produced ideas that the rest of the world is still absorbing. Music that defined what Western classical composition could be. A theory of the mind that changed how humans understood themselves. A diplomatic method that became the model for international order. A philosophy that shaped how science and language are understood. And a diaspora that carried all of it to every corner of the English-speaking world. What made Vienna capable of this? The coffee houses, the empire's diversity, the proximity of languages and cultures and disciplines in a small, dense, walkable city, the pressure of a society that was simultaneously brilliant and repressive, the particular urgency of a world that felt like it was ending, all of it together, in one city, for a brief, unrepeatable moment. The cities that change the world are rarely the largest. They are the ones where the right people arrive at the right moment. Next, why Prague became the city where the modern world began to break. This video explores history and disputed theories for educational purposes.